Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 1022. While there was a hot fix to a few things shortly after 1022 came out, the meta seems to have stabilized into a healthy place. What this means is that there's actually a lot of different ways to play the game right now, so the overall power difference between each tier of synergies is not that much. It all comes down to what you roll and what items you have. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our list today, we have the synergies in the S tier. This consists of Adept, Enlightened, Hunter, Mystic, and Dusk. These synergies are doing the best in the current meta and are an integral aspect to consistently placing in the top 4. Up first is Adept. Adept has really solidified itself in the meta because of how easy it is to splash in Shen with Aurelia. Those two form an easy foundation to build from, whether you're playing Hunter, Enlightened, Assassin, and quite a few other comps. Adept as a trait is also quite useful, as a player not running Quicksilver on their main carry will feel the consequences immediately. Another aspect of Adept is that the attack speed slow affects mana generation, as slower attack speed translates into slower mana gain, causing abilities to go off later in the fight. But the best part of Adept is definitely the champions, with Shen and Aurelia having great secondary tags. Mystic is easy to splash in along with Shen, and Divine plus Enlightened becomes available when playing Aurelia. All in all, Adept is a really strong splash trait that we highly recommend you use. Naturally, we have to pair Adept with the trait that it's strong with, which is Enlightened. Initially, Enlightened was the talk of the town at the beginning of 1022, but after Morgana was nerfed, the popularity of the trait went down slightly. But then players realized that Morgana is still good, just not as a main carry, and the rest of the Enlightened champions are also strong, especially Talon. So now Talon is the meta carry to play for, with the rest of the Enlightened champions being valuable for their secondary traits and the abilities. As we mentioned, Adept and Enlightened are often paired together because of Aurelia. But the combination of these two synergies needs to be touched upon, because in the instance of an Enlightened Adept player going against someone without Adept, the Enlightened player has a huge advantage. This is because their Enlightened champions will gain mana much faster, and Adept is going to drastically slow down the enemy champions. This often leads to a snowball effect that gives the Enlightened Adept player a large advantage. Make sure you play these two traits together even if you're playing a composition around Talon as a carry. Next up is Hunter. Hunter, which primarily means Ashe carry, is really strong right now because the trait can do so much burst damage. Especially once you have 3 or 4 Hunters, the amount of damage they do when the trait procs is quite high. Plus, Ashe is just an all-around good carry, even more so now that she properly works with Infinity Edge. It should also be noted that the Hunter trait ignores the Adept slow, as it's on a timer of when it goes off, not based on your champion's attack speed, meaning Hunter is a decent counter into Adept. The trait also does so much damage, it will burst around frontline champions like Sejuani, making Vanguard far less useful than it used to be. As usual, we have Mystic up in the S tier. Set 4 is still heavily magic damage focused, so splashing in Mystic is almost always valuable. Even more so now for the current meta, considering Shen is a Mystic Adept and Janna is Enlightened Mystic, so you will see those two played often. And the last trait for S tier is Dusk. Dusk may not fully deserve to be in S tier, but it is the trait doing the best that isn't Enlightened, Adept, or Hunter. And it doesn't need any of those synergies to do well, it's on its own little island. It can struggle against those synergies, but overall it does well enough with Riven as the carry that it will consistently get you top 4 finishes. Let's move on to the synergies in the A tier. This tier consists of Dazzler, Assassins, Sharpshooters, Elderwood, Brawler, and Exile. These are often the companion synergies to the ones in S tier, with a few being viable options outside of those top synergies. Up first is Dazzler. Dazzler is quite good with Enlightened because of Morgana, so it makes it a natural companion trait for the compositions using Enlightened. It's also quite useful against attack damage builds like Duelist, Hunter, and Sharpshooter. The main issue is it's hard to fit into a composition not running Enlightened, so it's a bit limited in what builds you'll play it in. Assassins are doing well mainly because of Talon, but there's also quite a few builds using Assassin that don't just rely on Enlightened and Talon. For example, Diana carry uses Moonlight to obtain a Diana 4, and Diana then becomes the main carry. Ninja Assassin is not as strong as it once was, but Akali is still viable, although the main carry tends to be Zed in those builds. All in all, Assassins as a trait provides valuable access to the enemy backline, which is quite important in a meta where Ashe is a main carry. Next, we have Sharpshooters. Sharpshooters fell off hard for a bit, but after the Morgana nerf, they've slowly risen back into being a viable comp. They will struggle against talent in other assassin compositions, although ZZ Rot Portal can help in those cases. Overall, what matters most for Sharpshooters is making sure you have Quicksilver on your main carry, whether that's Jhin or Jinx, to prevent being CC'd by Adept and Dazzler at the beginning of a fight. Elderwood is basically only useful because of Ashe. There's not really any other composition or carry that you want to use for this trait to do well. But that's okay because the front line of Elderwoods is quite strong, and the increased stats that Ashe gains will often be enough to keep her alive in some dicey situations. Brawlers are in a similar situation as Elderwood, as they're only a viable frontline option to use to protect your Ashe. But Warwick also comes into play here because he's an okay secondary carry along with Ashe, and Brawler helps keep him alive longer. That said, you will primarily run both Elderwood and Brawler in your Ashe compositions as your frontline, and that's about it. The last trait in the A tier is Exile. Both Yone and Yasuo are quite strong champions in the current meta, with Yasuo being a terror in the early game and Yone pairing with Shen and Aurelia for Adept. Yasuo 3 is also the only way to play a duelist build, so he has value as a carry as well. Time to move on to the synergies in the B tier. This consists of Vanguard, Divine, Keeper, Duelist, Fortune, Ninja, Moonlight, the Boss, and Cultist. Basically, these synergies are quite good, but usually only in specific situations. Starting off B tier, we have Vanguard. Okay, Vanguard is in an odd place right now. Sejuani is amazing and is actually one of the best champions in the game for sure. Aatrox is also quite good, but definitely behind Sejuani. And then, that's really it. The other Vanguards aren't bad, but the armor buff matters less as the game goes on. This is because there's enough magic and physical burst damage that extra armor won't help against it. Essentially, what we're saying is Sejuani and Aatrox are amazing, but Vanguard isn't. Divine is a surprisingly good trait after it was nerfed into the ground, but it's mainly just a support trait for Warwick carry and a splash trait when running Aurelia and Lux. Besides Warwick carry, you can also turn Ashe into a Divine if you have a spatula, which makes the trait really good. Outside of those two situations, expect to only see it because of Aurelia and Lux. Keeper continues to dominate the early game and then fall hard after that. If you can get any chosen Keeper prior to doing the roll down at level 7, you'll often be in a good position to win streak because the shield is that useful early in the game. But it's definitely the type of trait you don't prioritize late game. Duelist can do well only in the situation where you find Yasuo 3. If you can 3-star him, great. Then this synergy becomes valuable. And as long as you have a Quicksilver for your Yasuo, you can easily top 4. But if you don't find Yasuo 3, there's really no point in ever using Duelist. Next up is Ninja. Ninjas honestly can do well, especially with Zed as a carry, but it's difficult to pull off. It's especially difficult against hot meta compositions. So if you want to run ninjas, try to make sure you have the proper items for Zed and can 3-star him, otherwise you're likely to get a bottom 4. It's like Duelist, except it's a bit harder to do consistently since Zed is a 2-cost champion and Yasuo is just a 1-cost. Fortune. Fortune is a fun synergy to play because the payoff can be almost enough to win you a game, depending on how many losses you're at when you win that round. But it's also very much so a bait synergy because you can get to a certain amount of losses and think you have to win to get the value, or all of the health lost was a waste. So we recommend Fortune only if you have a really good grasp on how to pull yourself out of a loss streak, otherwise it's safer not to bother with it. Moonlight has really fallen onto some tough times with Aphelios not being a carry anymore. But there is some hope as both Diana 4 and Lissandra 4 can be okay carries. That said, it's incredibly niche because you need one of them as a Moonlight chosen, and then you have to 3-star both of them. That specifically is what keeps the synergy down in the B tier. The boss, or Set, is still not performing up to his previous standards. That said, he's an okay 5-cost champion to add in late game, and does have value when running Ashe if you have the Brawler Elderwoods as your front line. Outside of that, you're generally better off going for other 5-cost champions like Yone, Ezreal, Zillion, or Azir. And the last B tier synergy is Cultist. Cultists still haven't found their place in the meta. There are times where a high roll 9 Cultist game looks promising, but even then it still falls short of getting a first place finish. So until the meta shifts a bit where Cultist is a viable option, we recommend using it primarily as an early game tool when you're able to find a chosen Cultist. On to the last tier for today, C tier. The synergies in this tier are Mage, Warlord, Spirit, Shade, Tormented, and Emperor. Overall, these synergies have a place in the meta, but are much less effective than the other synergies. Mage doesn't really have much place in the meta unless you're running Nami 3. If you're playing that composition, then yes, Mage can be useful, at least as a 3-piece synergy. 6 Mage, unfortunately, is not useful at all and should be avoided. Ahri can still work as a carry, by the way, but she's better off without the Mage trait. Next, we have Warlord. Let's start this off by saying that a high-roll Warlord game can actually win games, but it requires you to hit 9 Warlords, a Azir 2, and have a strong 3-star carry. The fact is, you're rarely ever going to get all of those pieces together to make Warlord a consistently viable option. Otherwise, as a trait, Warlord doesn't bring much to the table beyond being an okay Stage 2 synergy. Spirit really hasn't found its place in the meta ever since the nerfs happened to it and Ahri. It can still be useful though in the rare situations that you run it, and Ahri is still a decent carry option, which means you'll usually have a Spirit with her because of Yuumi. Shade is still amazing for Zed, and that's it. Even then, ninjas can do more for Zed, so only use this as a trait when you can find a chosen Zed for a ninja assassin build. Unfortunately, Tormented, or Kayn, is still underperforming in the meta. He's not a bad late game 5 cost if you can 2-star him, but his impact on the game is far less than it used to be. Once he receives some fixes to how his ability functions, we should see him return to the forefront of the late game meta. Okay, Emperor is really only at the bottom of C tier because it's just kind of a lame trait for a 5-cost champion. We're a bit harsh on it because of that, even though Azir as a champion is doing really well in the meta. But all the Emperor does is make 2 stationary sand guards that don't attack, which can be useful, but really, is that all that Azir gets? Especially when compared to Tormented or the boss. So sure, it's not bad, but it really doesn't feel fitting for a 5-cost champion. That's all we have for today's tier list video. The meta has settled into a really healthy spot with a lot of the synergies being viable. Sure, there's a few that stand above the rest like Adept or Enlightened, but overall you can play a multitude of traits and still do well. Let us know in the comment section below what synergies you think deserve to be higher or lower on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.